Some of the most important moments in a person's life do not look important when they are happening. On a crowded morning in downtown Chicago, the world moved with its usual indifference, people rushing through sidewalks, conversations blending into noise, and lives passing each other without acknowledgement. Among them was Emily Carter, a 25-year-old white woman who never believed her actions were significant enough to be noticed by anyone beyond the immediate moment. She was not trying to stand out, nor was she trying to be remembered. She simply moved through the city the way she always did, with quiet awareness of others and a patience that often made her invisible in a world that rewarded urgency over kindness. That morning, she boarded a city bus filled beyond comfort, the kind of space where personal boundaries became flexible and silence became a shared agreement of endurance. She stood near the middle section, holding onto a metal rail, observing the tired expressions around her, until her attention was drawn to a pregnant woman who struggled to maintain balance as the bus continued forward. No one immediately reacted. People adjusted their gaze, looked at their phones, or pretended not to notice the discomfort that was unfolding just a few feet away. It was not cruelty, but indifference shaped by repetition, the kind that forms when people learn to ignore small moments of need in order to preserve their own convenience. Emily did not hesitate for long. She simply shifted her position, stepped forward, and offered her seat without making a scene, without expectation of acknowledgement, and without turning it into something that required attention. The pregnant woman accepted with visible relief, offering a quiet expression of gratitude that lasted only a moment before the rhythm of the bus carried everything forward again. What Emily did not realize was that she was not the only person who had registered that moment. At the back of the bus, partially separated from the rest of the passengers by space and silence, sat Vincent Moretti, a 39-year-old white man whose presence did not rely on volume or movement to be felt. He did not react outwardly to what he saw. There was no immediate expression, no visible judgment, and no interruption of the scene unfolding in front of him. Instead, he observed with a kind of stillness that suggested he was not simply watching the action itself, but measuring something within it that others had overlooked. In his world, most actions were transactional, measured by intent, outcome, or advantage. Yet what he had just witnessed did not fit neatly into any of those categories. It was small, unannounced, and unnecessary from a practical standpoint, yet it existed without expectation of return. The bus continued its route through Chicago streets, carrying on with its usual rhythm, but something within Vincent's perception of the environment had subtly shifted. He did not speak to her. He did not acknowledge her publicly. He did not interrupt the moment with commentary or attention. Instead, he remained silent, allowing the image of what he had seen to settle into memory without distortion. Emily continued her journey unaware that the simple act she had performed had been observed in a way she could not yet understand. She saw herself as ordinary, as someone whose decisions carried no weight beyond immediate circumstance. But for Vincent, what he had witnessed did not remain ordinary. It became a reference point, something that quietly separated her from the background of indifference that defined everyone else on the bus. In that silence, without words exchanged or meaning declared, a line had been drawn in his perception, though she would never know it had happened. And as the bus continued through the city, carrying both of them forward into separate futures, neither of them yet understood that a single unnoticed act had already begun to change the way one powerful man would see a woman who believed she had gone completely unseen. The bus continued moving through the streets of Chicago as if nothing meaningful had happened, maintaining its usual rhythm of stops, acceleration, and shifting passengers who treated the space as temporary rather than significant. Emily Carter remained standing near the same section where she had offered her seat earlier, her attention no longer focused on the pregnant woman but instead on the ordinary flow of movement around her. She did not revisit the moment in her mind. For her, it had already been completed, absorbed into the category of small decisions that required no further reflection. She adjusted her grip on the metal rail as the bus turned, her expression calm, unassuming, and consistent with the way she had always carried herself in public spaces. What she did not realize was that the moment she had already dismissed was still active in someone else's perception. At the back of the bus, Vincent Moretti remained seated in the same position, his posture unchanged, his attention not on the environment as a whole, but anchored to a single point within it. He was not studying Emily in a way that would have been visible or intrusive to others, yet his awareness of her presence was precise, as if the earlier action had created a reference that continued to inform his observation of everything she did afterward. Around him, passengers shifted, conversations started and ended, and the city passed by through the windows in fragmented motion, but none of it carried the same weight as the quiet interaction he had already witnessed. Vincent did not attempt to interpret her character in broad terms. Instead, he focused on the structure of her behavior in that specific moment, the absence of hesitation, the lack of attention-seeking, and the way she had acted without adjusting her decision based on how it might be perceived. This distinction mattered more than the act itself. In his world, actions were often shaped by calculation, even when they appeared generous on the surface, yet what he had seen did not present itself as calculation. It presented itself as instinct without audience. The bus slowed as it approached another stop, and new passengers entered, filling the remaining space with additional noise and movement. Emily briefly shifted to make room, her attention momentarily moving away from her internal thoughts as she adjusted to the changing environment. She still did not notice Vincent watching her. If anything, she considered herself less relevant than the people around her, blending into the background of daily life in a way that required no recognition. However, Vincent's perception of her had already separated her from that background in a way she could not yet perceive. He did not assign meaning to her beyond what he had seen, but he also did not allow that moment to dissolve into insignificance. It remained present in his awareness with a clarity that was unusual for him, not because it was dramatic, but because it was unnecessary and therefore unprotected by self-interest. As the bus continued forward, the distance between them remained unchanged physically. Yet internally a separation had formed in how the same moment was understood. Emily existed within the continuity of her ordinary day, unaware of any shift beyond the seat she had given up, while Vincent carried forward the quiet imprint of that action as something that resisted dismissal. It did not yet change anything external between them, but it altered the way he registered her presence in a way that would not fade quickly. And in that silent divergence of perception, the ordinary movement of the bus through Chicago carried both of them toward a future neither had yet begun to recognize. The bus ride continued through Chicago's midday traffic, blending into the familiar rhythm of urban movement where each stop brought in new passengers and removed others without leaving any lasting trace of interaction. Emily Carter remained in her position near the center of the bus, her posture steady and her expression neutral, as she gradually shifted her attention away from the earlier incident. For her, the act of giving up her seat had already been completed in its entirety, existing now only as a small moment of courtesy that required no further mental space. She did not revisit it, nor did she assign it significance beyond the immediate context in which it occurred. In her understanding of the world, kindness did not require preservation in memory to remain valid. It simply existed and then moved on. What she did not know was that this interpretation of the moment was not shared by everyone who had witnessed it. At the rear of the bus, Vincent Moretti remained seated in the same position he had chosen earlier, his presence unchanged despite the shifting environment around him. The noise of the bus, the movement of passengers, and the passing cityscape outside the windows did not interfere with his focus. Instead, his attention remained anchored to Emily in a way that was not intrusive in action, but precise in observation. He did not follow her movements openly, yet every small adjustment she made within the shared space was registered with a clarity that suggested sustained interest rather than passing attention. Vincent did not interpret her behavior through emotion. He interpreted it through pattern. The earlier moment, when she had offered her seat without hesitation, remained the reference point through which he now viewed everything else she did. It was not the action itself that held importance for him, but the absence of calculation within it. In his environment where decisions were often filtered through strategy, influence, or advantage, that absence stood out in a way that was difficult to ignore. As the bus slowed near another intersection, sunlight briefly shifted across the interior, creating changing reflections on metal poles and glass surfaces. Emily adjusted her stance slightly, maintaining balance as the vehicle turned, her expression still calm and unremarkable. She was not aware of being observed in any meaningful way beyond ordinary public presence, and even if she had been, she would not have considered herself noteworthy. Her self-perception remained grounded in ordinariness, shaped by a life that did not reward attention. Vincent, however, continued to observe without altering his demeanor. He did not move closer, nor did he attempt to initiate interaction. Instead, he allowed the observation to remain passive yet continuous, as if he was gathering information that did not require immediate action to be meaningful. Around them, the bus continued its route, passengers entering and exiting in cycles that blurred individual presence into collective motion. Yet within that ordinary environment, a subtle distinction had formed in Vincent's perception. Emily was no longer simply another passenger. She had become a reference point against which other behaviors were unconsciously measured. This shift did not manifest externally, but it altered the internal structure of how he processed what he saw. The bus eventually came to another stop, and a few passengers shifted positions, creating brief interruptions in spatial arrangement. Emily remained unaware of any change beyond the immediate physical adjustments required by movement. She did not sense the attention directed toward her, nor did she anticipate that a single earlier decision had been preserved with such precision in another person's awareness. Vincent did not speak. He did not act. Yet the silence between them had begun to take on a different quality, one defined not by interaction, but by recognition that had not yet been acknowledged aloud. And as the bus continued through the city, carrying both of them forward through ordinary time, the distance between what she believed she was and what he had begun to perceive quietly widened without either of them realizing that a subtle transformation had already begun. The progression of the bus journey through Chicago had begun to create a pattern that neither Emily Carter nor Vincent Moretti could consciously identify as significant. Yet both were now participating in a shared moment that was gradually accumulating meaning through repetition and observation. Emily remained in her usual state of quiet focus, her attention directed outward toward the passing environment rather than inward toward reflection. She had already mentally closed the earlier incident involving the pregnant passenger, categorizing it as a completed act of courtesy that required no further emotional processing. In her understanding of daily life, such actions were natural responses to immediate circumstances, not events that defined identity or deserved extended contemplation. What she did not recognize was that, within the same confined space, her behavior was being observed with a level of attention that extended beyond casual awareness. Vincent Moretti continued to sit at the back of the bus, his posture unchanged, his expression controlled and unreadable to those around him. He did not engage with the environment in a way that suggested participation, yet his awareness of Emily had become increasingly structured rather than incidental. He was no longer simply noting a single act from earlier in the journey. Instead, he was observing continuity, how she moved, how she adjusted to the presence of others, and how she consistently positioned herself within shared space without drawing attention to her own actions. This consistency created a perception that was difficult for him to dismiss. In his world, where most behaviors could be traced back to intention or advantage, her lack of visible calculation stood out in a way that did not align with his usual framework of interpretation. As the bus slowed at another intersection, the interior shifted slightly with the motion, causing passengers to adjust their balance and reposition themselves. Emily did the same without hesitation, her movements efficient and unremarkable, reinforcing the sense of natural ease that defined her presence. She was not aware that these small, ordinary adjustments were being recorded mentally with precision by someone who rarely allowed minor details to remain unexamined. Vincent did not interpret her actions emotionally. Instead, he observed them as data points within a pattern that was gradually forming clarity. The earlier moment, the decision to give up her seat, remained central, but it was now being reinforced by everything that followed it. Each additional observation did not replace the first impression but strengthened its structure. The bus continued through the city, its interior filled with fragmented conversations, mechanical sounds, and shifting light from passing buildings. Yet within this ordinary movement, Vincent experienced a subtle narrowing of focus that separated Emily from the rest of the environment. She was no longer simply another passenger moving through shared space. She had become a consistent point of reference within his attention, not because she demanded it, but because she did not. Emily, meanwhile, remained unaware of any change in how she was being perceived. Her understanding of herself remained unchanged, grounded in simplicity and routine. She did not consider her actions significant beyond their immediate context, nor did she imagine that they could alter how someone else interpreted her presence. This lack of self-awareness reinforced the contrast between perception and reality unfolding within the same confined space. Vincent's observation did not create interaction, but it did create continuity. He did not speak, and he did not alter his position, yet his attention remained steady in a way that suggested increasing internal recognition rather than passing curiosity. The bus eventually continued forward, carrying both of them deeper into the city's movement. But within Vincent's perception, something had already shifted beyond the boundaries of ordinary observation. Emily was no longer defined solely by her actions. She was now defined by the consistency he saw within them, and in that quiet distinction, without words or acknowledgement, a new layer of awareness had already begun to form between them. The bus continued moving through the city of Chicago, its steady motion creating a rhythm that felt unchanged on the surface. Yet within it a subtle transformation was unfolding between Emily Carter and Vincent Moretti that neither of them could fully articulate. Emily remained seated near the middle section of the bus after the earlier congestion had eased slightly. Her posture relaxed in a natural way that suggested she had already mentally moved on from the earlier events of the day. She was not thinking about recognition, observation, or significance. Her focus remained anchored in the immediate present, shaped by routine awareness rather than reflection. She adjusted her position slightly as the bus turned, maintaining balance with quiet efficiency, her expression unchanged and her attention directed outward through the window where the city passed in fragmented motion. What she did not realize was that her ordinary stillness had become increasingly structured in someone else's perception. At the rear of the bus, Vincent Moretti remained in the same seat, his posture controlled, his presence quiet but steady in a way that did not draw attention from other passengers yet remained internally active in his own awareness. He was no longer simply observing isolated behavior. Instead, he was tracking consistency. Each small movement Emily made, each adjustment in posture, each moment of stillness between interactions with the environment was being registered as part of a broader pattern that he had begun to recognize without fully naming it. In his world where actions were often filtered through intention, strategy, or outcome, her behavior stood apart precisely because it did not present itself as calculated. There was no visible effort to be seen, no attempt to influence perception, and no indication of awareness that she might be observed at all. This absence of self-positioning created a form of clarity in his observation that was uncommon in his experience. As the bus slowed near another intersection, the interior shifted slightly with the movement of traffic outside, causing subtle changes in light and reflection across the windows and metal surfaces. Emily adjusted naturally, maintaining her balance without interruption, her focus remaining on the external environment rather than the internal dynamics of the space she occupied. She did not sense that her presence had become more defined in someone else's perception over time. To her, the bus remained what it had always been, a temporary shared environment where individuals moved independently without deeper connection. Vincent, however, was no longer viewing her as simply part of that collective movement. His attention had begun to isolate her not physically, but perceptually, distinguishing her behavior from the background of routine passenger activity. This distinction was not based on dramatic action, but on repetition without deviation. The earlier moment when she had offered her seat had initiated this shift, but it was the continuation of her behavior afterward that reinforced it. Each observation added structure rather than altering interpretation, creating a sense of continuity that was difficult to ignore. The bus continued its route through Chicago streets, passing storefronts, intersections, and clusters of pedestrians, all of which blended into a familiar urban rhythm. Yet within Vincent's internal awareness, Emily had become a consistent reference point that shaped how he interpreted everything else around her. She was no longer simply part of the environment. She had become a fixed element within it, defined not by prominence, but by consistency of behavior that resisted the unpredictability he typically associated with human interaction. Emily remained unaware of this shift entirely. Her experience of the moment remained unchanged, grounded in simplicity and absence of expectation. She did not interpret her actions as noteworthy, nor did she consider that they might carry meaning beyond their immediate context. This contrast between perception and awareness continued to widen quietly between them as the bus moved forward, carrying both through the city's layered movement. And within that silent progression, without acknowledgement or interaction, Vincent Moretti's understanding of Emily Carter had begun to transition from simple observation into something more enduring, shaped not by what she did once, but by the quiet certainty of what she continued to do without ever trying to be seen. The bus continued its steady route through the streets of Chicago, maintaining the same predictable rhythm of movement that had carried Emily Carter and Vincent Moretti through the city for what felt like an ordinary stretch of time, even though the internal significance of their shared space had quietly evolved beyond ordinariness for at least one of them. Emily remained seated in the same general area after the earlier shifts in passenger positions, her posture relaxed and natural, her attention directed outward through the window where buildings, traffic, and pedestrians blurred into a continuous stream of urban motion. She did not revisit the earlier act she had performed, nor did she assign it additional meaning beyond the immediate circumstances in which it had occurred. In her internal framework, the day remained unchanged, composed of small, unconnected moments that did not require deeper interpretation. She adjusted slightly as the bus moved over uneven pavement, her expression steady, her presence calm and unassuming. At the rear of the bus, Vincent Moretti maintained his position with the same controlled stillness that had defined his presence since the beginning of the journey. However, within his perception, the structure of what he was observing had shifted in a way that no longer resembled simple acknowledgement of an isolated action. He was no longer focused on a single moment in isolation. Instead, his attention had formed a continuous thread, connecting what he had seen earlier to everything he had observed since. Emily was no longer registered in his awareness as a passenger among many. She had become a consistent pattern of behavior that stood apart from the surrounding environment, not through volume or display, but through absence of calculation. In his experience, most human behavior contained visible indicators of intention, even in subtle forms, yet hers did not present itself in that way. It existed without adjustment, without performance, and without awareness of observation, which made it increasingly distinct in his perception. As the bus slowed near another intersection, the shift in momentum caused slight changes in posture among the passengers, small adjustments that occurred naturally within shared space. Emily responded in the same way she always had, without hesitation or excess movement, maintaining balance with quiet efficiency. She did not perceive any difference in how she was being observed because, from her perspective, nothing had changed. The world outside the bus remained the primary field of her attention, and the people within it remained temporary presences passing through shared proximity without deeper connection. Vincent, however, was no longer interpreting her within that same framework. His observation had transitioned from moment-based recognition to pattern-based awareness. Each instance he witnessed reinforced the earlier one rather than replacing it, creating a continuity that strengthened rather than diluted his perception. The earlier act of kindness was no longer an isolated reference point. It had become the origin of a pattern that he was now tracking without conscious effort, as if the behavior itself was revealing structure through repetition. The bus continued forward through Chicago's layered cityscape, passing storefronts, intersections, and clusters of movement that formed the constant rhythm of urban life. Yet within Vincent's internal awareness, Emily had become separated from that rhythm not physically, but perceptually. She was still part of the environment, still physically present among other passengers, yet her actions no longer blended into the background in the same way. They stood apart in a quiet, almost imperceptible distinction that was not dramatic but consistent. Emily remained unaware of this shift entirely. Her sense of self remained unchanged, grounded in simplicity and routine. She did not evaluate her actions as meaningful beyond their immediate context, nor did she consider the possibility that they might be preserved in someone else's memory with greater significance than she assigned to them herself. This lack of internal emphasis reinforced the very quality that Vincent was observing, creating a paradox in which the less importance she placed on her actions, the more distinct they became in his perception. As the bus approached another stop, passengers shifted again, preparing to exit or enter, the cycle of movement continuing without interruption. Emily remained seated, her attention still directed outward, her presence calm and unremarkable to anyone observing casually. Vincent did not move or alter his expression, but his internal awareness remained fixed, now less on what she had done and more on what she consistently revealed through the absence of intention. And as the bus continued its path through the city, carrying both forward through the same physical space. A silent separation in perception deepened between them, defined not by interaction, but by the growing difference between how one woman understood herself and how one man had begun to quietly, persistently, and without explanation understand her instead. The bus continued its steady movement through Chicago's streets, maintaining the same predictable rhythm of stops, turns, and shifting passengers. Yet within the enclosed space something had already shifted in a way that was no longer dependent on physical proximity but instead on perception, especially within the mind of Vincent Moretti. Emily Carter remained seated near the center section of the bus, her posture relaxed in a natural way that reflected neither awareness of scrutiny nor expectation of consequence. She observed the city passing through the window, her attention resting on external motion rather than internal reflection, as she had done throughout most of the journey. For her, nothing about this moment carried additional weight beyond the simple continuity of a routine day. The earlier act of kindness had already been placed in the past of her awareness, existing only as a completed decision that required no further consideration. She adjusted slightly as the bus shifted lanes, maintaining balance with effortless familiarity, her expression unchanged and calm. At the rear of the bus, Vincent Moretti remained still, his posture composed and his outward behavior unchanged from the beginning of the ride. Yet internally his awareness of Emily had deepened into something that no longer resembled passive observation. It was no longer a matter of noticing a single act or recalling a single moment. Instead, his perception had evolved into a continuous recognition of pattern, where each small detail reinforced the structure of what he had already begun to understand. Emily was no longer simply a passenger within his field of vision. She had become a consistent deviation from expectation, not because she demanded attention, but because she did not. In his experience, most individuals revealed themselves through intention, repetition of self-interest, or subtle signals of awareness regarding how they were perceived. Emily, however, did none of these things. Her behavior remained unadjusted by the presence of others, as if her actions existed independently of observation itself. As the bus slowed near another intersection, light shifted across the interior, creating brief variations in tone and reflection on surfaces and windows. Passengers adjusted their stance, some moving closer to exits, others preparing for continued travel, but Emily remained within her quiet state of observation, unaffected by the subtle transitions around her. She did not interpret the environment as meaningful beyond its immediate function, nor did she consider the possibility that she was being perceived with anything beyond ordinary attention. Vincent, however, was no longer processing her as part of the general environment. His attention had narrowed not through choice but through accumulation, as each observation reinforced the last without contradiction. The earlier moment on the bus, the act of offering her seat, had not faded in significance. Instead, it had become the foundation of a pattern that he now recognized as stable rather than incidental. This stability was what distinguished her in his perception, not through dramatic behavior but through consistency of absence, the absence of calculation, performance, or visible awareness of evaluation. The bus continued forward through the layered cityscape of Chicago, passing streets filled with movement and buildings that reflected the constant rhythm of urban life. Yet within Vincent's internal framework, Emily had become increasingly separated from that background, not physically but conceptually. She was no longer interchangeable with the surrounding presence of other passengers. Instead, she represented a continuity that he could trace across time within the same journey, a continuity defined not by action but by the lack of deviation from herself. Emily remained entirely unaware of this shift. Her understanding of her own behavior had not changed, nor did she assign significance to anything beyond the immediate circumstances of the present moment. This lack of self-referential interpretation reinforced the very quality that Vincent was observing, creating a widening gap between how she experienced herself and how she was being silently recorded within his awareness. As the bus approached another stop, the flow of passengers shifted once again, creating brief interruptions in spatial arrangement and sound. Emily remained seated, still grounded in her quiet observation of the outside world, while Vincent maintained his position at the rear, unchanged in appearance but increasingly focused in perception. And as the bus continued its route through Chicago, carrying both of them through the same physical space without acknowledgement of the growing divide in understanding, What had begun as a single unnoticed act of kindness had already expanded into something far more persistent within the mind of the man who had seen it, shaping a perception that neither distance nor silence was able to diminish. The bus continued its route through Chicago as the afternoon light began to shift slightly, casting longer shadows across the interior and softening the sharp reflections on metal poles and glass surfaces. Yet within this ordinary movement something had already reached a point of internal completion in the perception of Vincent Moretti that no longer depended on external change. Emily Carter remained seated near the center section of the bus, her posture unchanged, her attention still directed outward toward the passing cityscape, where buildings, pedestrians, and traffic signals blended into a continuous flow that required no interpretation beyond immediate observation. She did not revisit earlier moments in her mind, nor did she assign additional meaning to the small decisions she had made throughout the journey. For her, the day remained consistent with itself, composed of separate instances that did not require connection beyond their immediate context. She adjusted her position slightly as the bus slowed, maintaining balance with quiet efficiency, her expression calm and unremarkable, reflecting no awareness of being observed in any significant way. At the rear of the bus, Vincent Moretti remained in the same position, his outward stillness unchanged, yet internally his perception had reached a level of clarity that no longer required further accumulation of detail. The earlier act, the decision to offer a seat without hesitation, had long since moved beyond the category of a single observation. It had become a defining reference point through which every subsequent detail was now filtered. Each movement Emily made did not add new meaning independently, but instead reinforced a single continuous impression that had formed in his awareness, that her behavior existed without calculation, without adjustment to external perception, and without visible self-interpretation. In his environment, where most actions carried underlying intent or strategic consideration, this absence created a form of distinction that could not easily be dismissed. As the bus approached another stop, passengers shifted in preparation for movement, some rising, others adjusting their stance, creating a brief wave of motion that altered the internal composition of the space. Emily remained unaffected by this change beyond what was physically necessary, her focus still directed outward, her awareness grounded in the present environment rather than in the interpretation of it. She did not perceive herself as significant within the structure of the moment, nor did she consider the possibility that her actions might be preserved in someone else's memory with greater emphasis than she assigned to them herself. Vincent, however, no longer experienced her presence as part of a general environment. His attention had transitioned from observation to internal recognition, where the distinction between single actions and continuous pattern had already been resolved. What remained was not curiosity but structure. Emily was now registered in his awareness not as an isolated subject, but as a consistent behavioral presence defined by lack of visible calculation. This did not create emotional interpretation in the conventional sense. Instead, it created recognition of stability within unpredictability, a rare quality in the world he occupied. The bus continued forward through the layered streets of Chicago, passing intersections, storefronts, and shifting pedestrian flows that reflected the constant motion of the city. Yet within Vincent's internal awareness, Emily no longer blended into that motion in the same way as others. She had become distinguishable not through action, but through the absence of deviation from herself across time. This perception did not require confirmation, nor did it depend on interaction. It existed as a quiet internal certainty formed through repetition without contradiction. Emily remained entirely unaware of this transition. Her understanding of her own behavior remained unchanged, grounded in simplicity and absence of reflection. She did not view herself through the lens of interpretation, and therefore did not recognize that such interpretation could exist elsewhere. This created a widening asymmetry between experience and observation, where one remained unexamined and the other had become increasingly defined. As the bus moved through another stretch of city blocks, the distance between them in physical space remained unchanged, yet within perception, a separation had formed that was no longer dependent on proximity. Vincent did not move, did not speak, and did not alter his expression, yet the internal structure of how he perceived Emily had already settled into permanence rather than momentary attention. And as the bus continued forward, carrying both of them through the ordinary rhythm of the city, what had begun as a simple unnoticed act of kindness had fully transformed within his awareness into a stable and lasting point of recognition that neither silence nor distance could diminish. The bus continued its steady movement through the final stretch of the route, carrying the remaining passengers through Chicago streets that had begun to shift in tone as afternoon light softened into a quieter, more reflective atmosphere. Inside the vehicle, the familiar rhythm of stops and motion persisted, yet within the internal awareness of Vincent Moretti, something had already reached a point of completion that no longer depended on what happened externally. Emily Carter remained seated in the same general area she had occupied for much of the journey, her posture unchanged, her attention still directed outward through the window where the city unfolded in fragments of motion and light. She did not revisit earlier moments, nor did she assign significance to the sequence of events that had occurred during the ride. For her, the experience remained unbroken in its simplicity, composed of separate instances that did not require interpretation beyond their immediate function. She adjusted slightly as the bus slowed near another stop, maintaining balance with quiet familiarity, her expression calm and consistent, revealing no awareness that anything about her presence had shifted in another person's perception. At the rear of the bus, Vincent Moretti remained in the same position, his outward stillness unchanged, yet internally the structure of his perception had already stabilized into something definitive. What had begun as a single observation, a brief moment of unexpected behavior, had evolved into a continuous internal recognition that no longer required reinforcement through new data. Emily was no longer viewed as a passenger among others. She had become a consistent point of reference within his awareness, defined not by action or intention, but by the absence of visible calculation in everything he had observed. This absence had created a clarity that was uncommon in his experience, where most individuals revealed themselves through patterns of strategic behavior, conscious or unconscious. As the bus approached its next stop, passengers shifted in preparation for movement, some rising from their seats, others adjusting their stance as the doors prepared to open. Emily remained unaffected by the surrounding transitions beyond what was physically necessary, her focus still anchored in the external world, rather than in the interpretation of it. She did not perceive herself as significant within the structure of the environment she occupied, nor did she consider the possibility that her actions had been preserved in memory with greater weight than she assigned to them herself. Vincent, however, no longer processed her presence as part of a collective environment. The earlier act, the decision to give up her seat without hesitation, had long since ceased to function as a single moment in time. It now existed as the foundation of a perception that had remained unchanged across every subsequent observation. Each detail he had registered since then had not altered that foundation, but instead reinforced its stability. The consistency of her behavior, the absence of performative awareness, and the natural continuity of her actions had formed a complete structure within his understanding that no longer required additional confirmation. The bus continued forward through the city, passing intersections where traffic lights changed in rhythmic cycles and pedestrians moved along sidewalks in patterns of daily routine. Yet within Vincent's internal awareness, Emily no longer blended into this environment in the same way as others. She had become distinct not through prominence, but through consistency that resisted contradiction. This distinction did not translate into visible change or external reaction. He did not speak, and he did not move differently than before. However, the way he perceived her had transitioned from observation to recognition, and from recognition to permanence. Emily remained entirely unaware of this shift. Her understanding of herself remained grounded in simplicity, shaped by a life that did not require external validation to define meaning. She did not interpret her actions as extraordinary, nor did she consider that they might be preserved beyond her own awareness of them. This created a silent divergence between how she experienced herself and how she existed within the perception of another person, a divergence that continued to widen without acknowledgement. As the bus neared the end of its route, the remaining passengers prepared to disembark, gathering belongings and adjusting positions in anticipation of arrival. Emily remained seated until the motion of the bus gradually slowed, her attention still directed outward, her expression unchanged. Vincent remained at the rear, still and composed, yet internally fully aware that nothing further was required to complete his understanding of what he had observed. And as the bus finally came toward its final stop, carrying both of them toward separate exits of the same shared moment, What had begun as a single unnoticed act of kindness had already settled within his perception as something permanent, unalterable, and quietly defining in a way that neither distance nor time could reduce.